Welcome to the Festival of Storytellers. I thank everybody that's involved with this process because we know writers need readers and writers need publishers.
Experience is not about the publisher, it is about us, the authors.
Well, good evening, everyone, and thank you for taking the time to visit with me to learn about my new book, American Insanity. I also want to thank those of you outside of the U.S. who are participating in this session. I know that the issues and concerns about government corruption isn't just an American problem, but a problem around the world. And I believe that what I address in my book mirrors many of the issues you are confronted with. Let me begin by telling you a little bit about myself. I am 78 years old, the oldest of 11 children, and grew up in Fargo, North Dakota. After graduating from high school, I joined the Marine Corps, which landed me in Vietnam during 1965 and 1966. Having survived that experience, I returned home and went back to school and got my degree in healthcare administration. I then spent 29 years working for the Department of Veterans Affairs as a healthcare administrator. I served at 7 different VA healthcare facilities around the country before I finally transferred to a VA headquarters in Washington, D.C. I spent the last 11 years of that 29-year career at the VA headquarters in Washington, first as the Chief of Policies and Operations, then as the Acting Director of Health Administration Service. It was during those 11 years and being a part of that Washington bureaucracy that I began to really learn about the workings of the Washington bureaucracy and the real level of corruption and power that the bureaucracy has over the governing of this country. In fact, I went to Washington very naive about our federal government, the politicians we elected to represent us, and who was in control. But it didn't take long before I realized that most of what I believed about our government and those we elected was no more than an illusion. I served 2 two-year terms as a township councilman, 11 years as a volunteer firefighter and EMT. I was elected to that fire department's board of directors and then to the chair of that board. I am married to a wonderful woman who is a retired clinical social worker who had her own private practice in psychotherapy. We have 4 children, 5 grandchildren, and 2 great-grandchildren. After moving so many times, we finally settled down in the Smoky Mountains just outside of Waynesville, North Carolina. So now let me begin telling you about my book. So why the title American Insanity? I chose that title, American Insanity, because I felt that it best describes what I write about in my book, namely, all of the insanity occurring within our federal government and within our society in general. I wanted a title that represented the insanity of our unconstitutional and bloated federal bureaucracy, and a title that describes for the potential reader all the insane, corrupt, unconstitutional atrocities the government is committing against those it was created to serve. All subjects which I cover in American Insanity. But before I move on and talk about the issues of political corruption, which I write about in my book, I want to first respond to questions that were asked in yesterday's session, which I wasn't able to get to. Those questions are as follows. Chad Warren asked, what advice can you give to the young Americans that will somehow hold America's future? My answer, my advice is for them to get involved with politics, but to do so from a Judeo-Christian stance. I want to also advise them that if your family or friends are those who refuse to get involved because they say you can't trust the government is corrupt, so what's the point? Because one person can't make a difference, and the excuses go on for their not getting involved or not participating with the election process. But I want to tell the young adults to not listen to them because they're wrong about the ability of one person to make a difference. Our government is corrupt and it is inept, but it is so because of we the people. It is our unwillingness to make the time and effort to stay abreast of what our politicians are doing or failing to do. Our unwillingness to maintain contact with our representatives to let them know how we feel about impending legislation, making them aware that we are watching and we will react if they fail to uphold their oath and commitments. And our unwillingness to make time to attend campaign rallies or events. And when we do attend, not to be afraid to ask hard questions of those running for office. Our government is not corrupt because of those we elect to Congress. Our government is corrupt because we as citizens of this country are failing to do our civic duty and hold those we elect accountable. I know from personal experience that a tremendous number of young adults are becoming more and more active. But we as parents, teachers, or mentors must continuously encourage our children to become involved, not by participating in protests or riots, by becoming involved within the government process. Because this is the only way, true way, to bring about change. Protests and riots only benefit the politicians, who then use those protests against the opposing parties, but do nothing to rectify the issues that those protestings are protesting about. Heather Taylor asked, how has your military service influenced your perspective on the importance of civic engagement and participation in political process? And Cecilia McCall asks a similar question. Can you share any personal experience from your time in service that have shaped your views on American politics? My answer to both questions is the same. It was my time in Vietnam, which I and those who served in Vietnam were led to believe that we were there to prevent communism from spreading and eventually coming to our country. And as young kids, we believed that. I served with a Marine Corps battalion which earned the nickname The Walking Dead. This was because of our loss of over 620 Marines killed in action in our battalion in 1 year period. I was well aware that the people of Vietnam did not want us there. And after I returned home, it became increasingly clear that the administration in power was making no real effort to win that war. After 55,000 plus fellow warriors being killed, we just packed up and left, leaving the country to the very people we were fighting, just like we did in Afghanistan. That experience led me to become a political activist. And instead of protesting in the street like so many others did, I chose to get involved with the governing of our country. Heather Taylor asked, "What inspired you to write a book about American politics? Is there a particular aspect or issue that you found compelling?" Well, it was the 11 years working in Washington, D.C. as a senior manager for the Department of Veterans Affairs, which required me to work closely with members of Congress and White House staff, that I began to become aware of the level of corruptness and ineptness of so many of the people I had to deal with. After I retired, I served 2-year terms as a city councilman and found that they had the same problems. I guess you could say that I became obsessed with corruption within our government, and I've been writing op-ed articles for years about the corruption that I identify through my research, and I share that information in my articles and on my blog. It was writing these articles that led me to decide to put all that information that I had found regarding corruption into this book. Tisha Groves asked, "Can you discuss any specific policies or reforms that you believe would strengthen the democratic process and increase citizen participation in American politics?" Well, my answer to that is that there are no policies or reforms that would increase citizen participation. In order to strengthen our republic and increase citizen participation requires the will of the people to do so. This will to participate is absent because of our failed federally funded school system, which no longer teaches our children about patriotism, about our Constitution, about the uniqueness of our form of government, and the importance of their being willing to participate in the governing of our republic. Harper Clark made the statement, "I wish we could learn more about each other instead of using our political views to drive a wedge against one another." And Ethan Johnson made the comment, "Let's not be polarizing." Well, my response to that is that I firmly believe that every non-politician or non-Washington elitist citizen would agree with Harper's and Ethan's statement 100%. But it is not we or each other that's driving a wedge between each other or polarizing our citizen. If you pay attention to what's going on in Washington between the political parties who are controlled by the wealthy elitists, it quickly becomes clear that it is they who are creating division with every issue which confronts our society. In my opinion, far too many individuals who serve as members of Congress are sociopaths, individuals who selfishly care only about their own self-interest and not about the interest of the citizens that they're there to serve. Both parties, I have learned, have only one goal, one mission, and that is to stay in power regardless of the cost to our citizens in our republic. The way they achieve this goal is by dividing the population and leading us to believe that it is their particular party which has all the answers and that they are the ones that are America's salvation. Right off the top, you can know that both parties are lying to the American people, because we all know that neither party ever gets anything done for the people. What legislation they ever get around to passing does little to help the average American citizen, but rather help big tech or big corporations and line the pockets of their election donors. We are a very diverse people with different ideologies, different values depending on our background, our religious beliefs, and different expectations from our government and so forth. Washington politicians know this. And once we're able to debate different ideas, different resolutions, and negotiate with each other to reach resolutions, which would be acceptable to the vast majority of Americans. Regino, I agree with your comment, but my experience with politicians is that, like I said, I believe that a majority of them are sociopaths, and they're not able to be honest or have integrity because they only see themselves as being the center of the universe. And so we people get left behind. Today, the ability of Congress to work together is no longer true, because in Washington, it has become a matter of staying in power, not of finding resolution to better the lives of our citizens, resolutions which would be acceptable to people of diverse ideology. Now, for every problem that they should be working on, they are quick to get in front of the news cameras and decry how their party is unable to make any progress because of the other party. Because the vast majority of us are either Republican or Democrat, depending on the party of the congressional member being interviewed. If that individual is of our party, we tend to take what they say as gospel. I believe that our parties have become a uniparty and equally want power over citizens and not to be servants of the citizens. Summer Vise asked the question, from your perspective, what are some of the key challenges facing American democracy today, and how can citizens contribute to addressing those challenges? Well, the key challenge we face with the governing of our republic is we the people. It's our citizens' failure to actively participate in governing our country, to be willing to make contact with their representatives and let them know when they are failing to keep their oath of office and their campaign promises, and to stop re-electing the same corrupt and incompetent individuals just because you recognize that person's name or because they are affiliated with your party. You need to get away from that and start doing research on candidates and electing people who truly represent your values and your expectation. That's what I say. Every voter must research the candidate that they are considering and assure themselves that those who they intend to vote for have the same values as you do. To research their voting records, which is readily available online, and see for yourself just how that candidate voted on legislation which you felt was important. So those are the questions that were asked yesterday. So now I can get back to my topic about government corruption. So, what is political corruption? Political corruption is the use of powers by government officials or their network contacts for illegitimate private gain. Forms of corruption in the federal government vary, but can include bribery, lobbying, extortion, or influence peddling. Corruption may facilitate misuse of government power for other purposes, such as repression of political opponents, all of which I address in my book. American Insanity helps shed light on the level of that corruption within our federal government, the extent to which our federal government is abusing its powers, and the extent to which our federal government is infringing upon our constitutional rights. Information mostly unknown to the general public because our mainstream news media has become so politicized that they no longer report any news that doesn't fit the ideology they support. And so they no longer can be trusted to be a watchdog over our government by staying neutral in their reporting, which, by the way, is why our founding fathers added freedom of the press in the Constitution. I wanted to bring to the attention of our citizens that information of government corruption the news medias are failing to report or are reporting inaccurately. Having been a part of the Washington bureaucracy, or the swamp if you prefer, for 11 years, I am very familiar on how that swamp works. So it is that swamp and the corruption within that swamp that I address at length in my book. My book addresses how and why political corruption undermines democracy and good governance by flaunting or even subverting formal processes. I speak of the corruption on our elections and in the legislature, which reduces accountability and distorts representation in policymaking. I speak of the corruption in the judiciary, which compromises the rule of law, and corruption in public administration, which results in the inefficient provision of services. I discuss how corruption undermines the legitimacy of our government and such democratic values as trust and tolerance. How corruption can impact government's provision of goods and services and increases the cost of goods and services, which arise from loss of the efficiency. I discuss how trading in influence or influence peddling is crippling our government. I talk about bribery within the federal government, which, by the way, is estimated to involve billions of dollars annually. Corruption in the United States is at its worst in decades, and it is a decay in U.S. political institutions. I write about how and why public confidence in U.S. elections has been undercut by disinformation and record-setting amounts of untraceable money in the election. This was especially true in 2020, when twice as much money was spent compared with 2016. I address how the programs and initiatives passed by Congress to help citizens are hotbeds of corruption. For instance, in the United States, there have been repeated reports of loans issued under the Payment Protection Program intended to support small businesses flowing to not so small businesses. Among the beneficiaries of these loans are defense contractors. Other examples of corruptions addressed is the COVID-19 epidemic, which was not just a health and economic crisis, but it was also a corruption crisis. These past few years has tested the government like no other period in memory. Government subsidies and grants have long been vulnerable to corruption, and that the more corruption our government is, the less money is available for their intended purposes. Another side effect of the pandemic, which I address in American Insanity, is how our government seized on it as an excuse to silence critics, curtail civil liberties, and increase surveillance. I discuss in my book about corruption as a cancer within the body of our society, a disease that eats at public trust and the ability of the government to deliver for our citizens. I go into how the poisonous effects of corruption impacts nearly all aspects of our society, intensifies social, political, and economic inequality and polarization, impedes the ability of government to respond to public health crisis, to deliver quality education, degrades the business environment and economic opportunity, drives conflict, and undermines faith in the government. That those we have elected to positions of trust, who then abuse that position of power for private gain, steal not just material wealth, but steal from the citizenry their ability to have trust and faith in the government. I go into how wealthy business interests corrupt politicians to receive favorable treatment by the government. For example, by offering legislators bribes, sometimes in the form of company shares or special privileges, done so to receive special benefits for the company. I want to point out that the issues I address in the book are broken down by departments, agencies, individuals within our federal government that most impact our everyday lives. The vast majority of my book is really about the corruption and ineptness of those we have elected and those who are unelected servants of the people within the federal bureaucracy. I address the level of denigration of our Constitution, the level of denigration our Constitution has suffered because of constitutional incorrect Supreme Court rulings and the outright ignoring of our Constitution by our corrupt government. I include chapters which lay out the impact that our failed public schools is having on the future of our children and the future of our constitutional republic. In other chapters, I lay out the extent to which our government is willing to go in order to silence American citizens with opposing viewpoints and why they are doing so. I talk about how and why our two-party political system is failing, America's insane shift from capitalism towards socialism, and the attempts being made by the Washington elitists to push America towards a globalist nation. I talk about the extent to which our federal government has been weaponized against its own citizen, and how the government is failing to conduct their actions and decisions within the confines of the constitutions. In short, what I'm attempting to do is to wake people up to the harsh realities that is today's America. And just to let everybody know, I'm currently working on my next book, which will be titled Government Gone Rogue, in which I will be addressing how and why our government has ceased to be a shield to protect its citizen and has now become a weapon against its own citizens in order to subdue us into subjects of the government. I'm in the early stages of writing that book, so I'm still 8 or 9 months out. But I think most of you will agree that there's a lot of corruption within our federal government to learn about. And I believe that the reader will finish reading American Insanity with a clearer understanding of just how deep that corruption really goes and how and why each and every one of us must become involved in holding our government officials accountable if we're to save our constitutional republic. I do hope that each of you will seriously consider buying a copy of American Insanity to learn the real extent to which our government and news media are failing our republic, and just how much people really don't realize what is going on within our federal government. I want to encourage everyone to visit my website, which is AmericanInsanity.org. That's American Insanity, one word, .org, AmericanInsanity.org. You'll find the links to purchasing my book at my website. And I want you to also consider, when you're visiting the website, to subscribe to my blog, in which I provide ongoing information regarding our government's corrupt actions and how and what each one of us can and must do to bring sanity back to our country. My book is available at BarnesandNobles.com. Enter in the search box American Insanity by LeRoy Cossette. And for Amazon, it's Amazon.com. And again, in the search box, enter American Insanity by LeRoy Cossette. With that, I want to thank all of you for being a part of this presentation. And please join me tomorrow at 12 noon. And at that time, I'll be answering the questions that you had that I wasn't able to get to. And I apologize for that. But I will be answering them tomorrow. So please join me. And thank you very much. Goodbye.